Beyond the aesthetic, building an invisible portfolio of intellectual and social capital. Introduction. What you cannot see is often what matters most. Welcome. Take a slow breath and settle in. We live in an age of the visible, of curated images, polished profiles, impressive titles, and the relentless performance of success. The pressure to look a certain way, to signal the right things, to present a surface that others will admire. This pressure is perhaps more intense now than at any previous moment in human history. And yet the most powerful forms of wealth, the forms of wealth that create enduring opportunity, deep resilience, and genuine freedom, are almost entirely invisible. They cannot be photographed. They do not fit neatly on a resume. They cannot be displayed in a social media post or signaled by the car you drive or the address where you live. They accumulate quietly, in the spaces between appearances, in the quality of your attention, in the depth of your thinking, and in the texture of your relationships. This audiobook is about those forms of wealth. It is about intellectual capital and social capital, what they are, why they matter more than almost any other asset you can build, and how to build them deliberately and consistently across the course of your professional and personal life. The title of this book is Beyond the Aesthetic. It is an invitation to shift your attention from the surface of things, the aesthetic layer of life, the impressions and appearances, to the substance underneath, because it is in the substance where the real game is played. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Two Invisible Portfolios. Before we explore how to build intellectual and social capital, let us be clear about what they actually are. Intellectual capital is the accumulated wealth of your mind. It includes your knowledge, not just formal credentials, but the deep, applied understanding of domains that matter. It includes your frameworks for thinking, the mental models, conceptual tools, and reasoning patterns that allow you to make sense of new situations quickly and accurately. It includes your creative capacity, the ability to generate novel ideas, to see connections others miss, and to synthesize information from different fields into original insights. And it includes your judgment, the hard-won wisdom that comes from reflecting on experience, making mistakes, correcting course, and gradually developing a more accurate map of how the world actually works. Intellectual capital is not the same as intelligence. Intelligence is a starting point, a natural capacity. Intellectual capital is what you build with that capacity over time through deliberate cultivation. A person of average natural intelligence who relentlessly develops their intellectual capital will, over time, vastly outperform a highly intelligent person who coasts on raw ability. Social capital is the accumulated wealth of your relationships. It includes the network of people who know and trust you, who would take your call, recommend you for opportunities, share relevant information with you, and advocate for you in rooms you are not in. It includes your reputation, story that circulates about you in your professional community, the qualities and values that people associate with your name when it comes up in conversation. It includes your influence, the ability to move people toward ideas, decisions, and actions through the quality of your relationships rather than through formal authority. And it includes access, the doors that open because of who you know and who knows you. Social capital is not the same as popularity or likability, though those can be components of it. Deep social capital is built on something more durable, on genuine value given to others, on trust earned through consistent integrity, on the kind of relationships that survive difficulty and deepen over time. Together, intellectual and social capital form what I am calling your invisible portfolio, the collection of assets that generates opportunities, creates leverage, and produces returns across decades in ways that no visible asset can match. Chapter 2. Why? The aesthetic trap is so dangerous. Before we talk about building the invisible portfolio, we need to talk about the trap that prevents most people from doing so. The aesthetic trap is a tendency to invest your energy, attention, and resources primarily in how things look, rather than in how they actually are. It is the professional who spends enormous energy managing their personal brand, but relatively little developing the substantive expertise that would actually justify that brand. It is the entrepreneur who invests in a beautiful office, impressive pitch decks, and carefully curated social media presence, while the underlying product is still mediocre. It is the person who accumulates a large social network of superficial connections while having almost no relationships of genuine depth or mutual trust. The aesthetic trap is seductive because appearances generate immediate, visible feedback. When you post something impressive and it receives validation, the feedback is instant and gratifying. When you develop deep knowledge in a complex domain, the feedback is slow, often invisible, and arrives only after sustained investment. Our brains are wired to respond to immediate visible feedback. The dopamine system, which drives motivation and habit formation, is much more powerfully activated by the quick win of social validation than by the slow compounding of genuine capability. This is why the aesthetic trap is not a character flaw. It is a natural response to the incentive structures of the modern information environment. But here is the fundamental problem with investing primarily in aesthetics. Appearances are brittle. They can be maintained only with constant energy. They create a reality gap, a growing distance between how things look and how they actually are, that becomes increasingly stressful to manage and increasingly dangerous when the gap is exposed. And in professional and social life, the gap between appearance and substance is eventually always exposed. The invisible portfolio is the antidote to the aesthetic trap, not because appearances do not matter. They do, as signals of the substance underneath, but because the sequence must be right. Substance first, the aesthetic, as an honest expression of the substance, not a substitute for it. Chapter 3. The compounding nature of intellectual capital. Of all the principles that govern the building of intellectual capital, perhaps none is more important than this. It compounds, just as financial capital, invested wisely, grows over time through the mechanism of compound interest, where returns generate further returns, and a base grows larger with each cycle. Intellectual capital compounds in a structurally identical way. Here is how the compounding works. Each new concept you genuinely understand becomes a lens through which you can more quickly and accurately understand the next concept. Each mental model you master becomes a tool that makes the acquisition of the next mental model faster. Each domain you develop expertise in gives you foundational analogies and frameworks that accelerate your learning in adjacent domains. The person who has invested 10 years in deep intellectual development does not just know more than the person who has invested 1 year. They learn faster, they understand more deeply, they generate better ideas, they make fewer fundamental errors. The gap between them grows, not linearly but exponentially, because the intellectual capital of the 10-year investor is compounding in ways that the 1-year investor has not yet experienced. This means that the single most important variable in intellectual capital development is when you start. The earlier you begin investing seriously in the quality of your mind, in depth of knowledge, in the clarity of your thinking, in the breadth of your conceptual frameworks, the more powerfully the compounding works in your favor. But it also means that it is never too late. The compounding begins the moment you begin investing. The person who starts at 40 will not have the returns of the person who started at 20 but they will have dramatically greater returns than the person who never starts at all. So how do you build intellectual capital deliberately? The first practice is deep reading, not the shallow scanning of headlines and social media, but the sustained, focused engagement with books and long-form writing that challenges your thinking, introduces new frameworks, and requires you to hold complex ideas in mind long enough to genuinely understand them. One serious book per month, read with full attention and reflection, will, over a decade, generate a body of intellectual capital that most people never accumulate in a lifetime. The second practice is cross-domain thinking. The most intellectually powerful people are those who think across disciplines, who bring the frameworks of biology to economics, the insights of psychology to strategy, the principles of physics to organizational design. Reading broadly, across fields distant from your primary expertise, is one of the highest return intellectual investments available. The third practice is writing. Writing forces clarity of thought in a way that nothing else quite replicates. When you write about what you know and think, you discover the gaps in your understanding, the inconsistencies in your reasoning, the vague impressions that have not yet crystallized into actual insight. Regular writing, whether for an audience or simply for yourself, is an extraordinarily effective tool for building intellectual capital. The fourth practice is deliberate reflection. The raw material of wisdom is experience, but experience without reflection produces habit, not wisdom. The person who does the same thing for 20 years without reflecting on it does not have 20 years of experience. They have 1 year of experience. Repeat it 20 times. Deliberate reflection, asking regularly what you are learning, where you were wrong, what you would do differently, and what the experience is revealing about how the world works, is the process by which raw experience is converted into genuine intellectual capital. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Social Capital. Social capital, like intellectual capital, is built through deliberate practice over time, but the principles that govern its construction are distinct and worth understanding clearly. The foundational principle of social capital is this: it is built by giving, not by taking. This sounds simple. It is profoundly misunderstood. Most people approach their professional networks as resources to be accessed, as collections of contacts to be leveraged when needed. They invest in relationships instrumentally and episodically, reaching out when they need something, going quiet when they do not. This approach produces thin, transactional relationships that generate very little social capital. People are perceptive about instrumentality. They recognize when they are being approached as a means to an end, rather than as a person of genuine interest and value. And the relationships that form on an instrumental basis, where one or both parties are primarily thinking about what they can get, are brittle, easily dissolved, and generate little of the trust that is the true currency of social capital. Genuine social capital is built through genuine generosity, through offering value before it is requested, through sharing knowledge, making connections, providing support, and giving attention to people whose success you genuinely care about, through showing up for people in the difficult moments, not just the celebratory ones, through being consistently honest even when honesty is uncomfortable. This kind of generosity, practiced over time, creates something invisible yet enormously powerful, a reputation for being someone who gives. And that reputation, the sense among people who know you that engaging with you is likely to be valuable, that you can be trusted, that you genuinely care about the outcomes of the people around you, is the foundation of deep social capital. The second principle of social capital is depth over breadth. It is tempting to believe that the size of your network is the measure of your social capital. The person with 10,000 LinkedIn connections, 500 business card exchanges at conferences, and a sprawling address book of acquaintances is not necessarily the person with the most social capital. They may actually have very little. Deep social capital lives in relationships of genuine mutual knowledge, trust, and care. These relationships take time to develop. They require shared experience, honest conversation, demonstrated reliability, and the kind of vulnerability that only emerges. You cannot have 1,000 of these relationships. Most people can sustain perhaps 5 to 15 relationships of genuine depth at any one time. The practice here is to resist the temptation to be everywhere and connected to everyone, and instead to invest seriously in a smaller number of relationships where genuine depth is possible. The 5 people who know you deeply, trust you completely, and care about your success will generate more social capital for you over a lifetime than 500 people who know your name and your professional title. The third principle of social capital is consistency over time. Trust is not built in a single interaction. It is built through the accumulation of many interactions, each one confirming or disconfirming the predictions you have made about another person's character. The person who is reliable across many small commitments, who does what they say they will do, who shows up when they are expected, who follows through without being reminded, builds trust far more powerfully than the person who makes impressive gestures occasionally, but is unpredictable enough. Day to day. Small consistent acts of integrity, multiplied over years, are the architecture of deep social capital. Chapter 5. The intersection, where intellectual and social capital multiply each other. One of the most important and least discussed aspects of building an invisible portfolio is the way intellectual and social capital multiply each other when both are present. Consider 2 people entering the same professional network. The first has deep intellectual capital, genuine expertise, sophisticated thinking, and a perspective shaped by years of serious intellectual investment, but has not invested in social capital. The second has broad social capital, a wide and trusting network, but has not invested deeply in intellectual development. The first person has wisdom that almost no one knows about. Their insights are real but inaccessible. They struggle to find the right platforms, the right introductions, and the right opportunities to apply their expertise in ways that generate returns. Their intellectual capital sits largely unmonetized. The second person has access and relationships, but often does not know what to do with them. They can get into rooms, but struggle to make an impression once there. They can make introductions, but often cannot offer the depth that turns an introduction into a lasting relationship. Their social capital generates activity but relatively little value. The person with both genuine intellectual depth and genuine social richness experiences something different. Their ideas travel because their relationships create distribution. Their relationships deepen because their ideas create genuine value for the people in them. Each new intellectual development becomes a gift to their network. Each new relationship brings new intellectual stimulation and perspective. The 2 capitals feed each other in a virtuous cycle that accelerates returns on both. This is why building both simultaneously, rather than sequencing them, is the highest leverage strategy. Not because you have to develop both equally at all times, but because even modest investments in the less developed capital tend to dramatically amplify the returns on the more developed one. Chapter 6. Invisible Capital in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. We are living through one of the most significant shifts in the value of different types of capital in human history. The rise of artificial intelligence is rapidly and radically changing what kinds of knowledge and capability are scarce and therefore valuable, and what kinds are becoming abundant and therefore increasingly commoditized. Procedural knowledge, the ability to execute well-defined tasks according to established rules, is becoming dramatically less scarce. Tasks that once required years of training can now be approximated by AI systems in seconds. This includes many forms of writing, coding, analysis, research, and design. The economic value of being able to do these things competently, without bringing anything distinctive to them, is declining. What is becoming more valuable, not less, in this environment is precisely what cannot easily be replicated by a language model: genuine original thinking, the ability to ask the questions that reveal what actually matters, the judgment that comes from deep contextual experience, the creative synthesis that connects domains in non-obvious ways, and the relational depth that makes trust and collaboration possible. In other words, exactly the kinds of intellectual and social capital we have been discussing throughout this audiobook. The person who has invested in genuine intellectual depth, not in the ability to retrieve information, but in the ability to think clearly, to judge well, to reason across domains, and to generate original perspectives, is becoming more valuable, not less. The person who has invested in genuine social capital, in deep trusting relationships, in a reputation for integrity and care, in the kind of collaborative influence that cannot be automated, is more valuable than ever. The aesthetic trap, in the age of AI, is becoming even more dangerous, because AI can produce impressive-looking content, polished presentations, and well-structured arguments cheaply and at scale. The gap between looking like you have substance and actually having it is about to become much more visible and much more consequential. The invisible portfolio is the competitive advantage most suited to the world we are entering. Chapter 7. Daily Practices for Building the Invisible Portfolio. Let us turn now to the practical, to the specific daily habits and practices that, sustained over time, build intellectual and social capital in ways that compound. For intellectual capital, the daily practices are these. Read for depth every day, even 30 minutes of focused, reflective reading, not skimming, not multitasking, but genuinely engaged reading of material that challenges and expands your thinking, will, compounded over years, create an intellectual foundation that few of your peers will have built. Write to think. Keep a journal, a notebook, or a writing practice of any kind, where you process your experiences, test your ideas, and work through your confusions. Writing is thinking made visible, and the discipline of making your thinking visible accelerates its refinement. Seek out ideas that challenge your current understanding. The most dangerous intellectual habit is the one that leads you to consume only material that confirms what you already believe. Actively seek out thoughtful perspectives that differ from yours, not to be destabilized, but to stress test your thinking and discover where it is weakest. Teach what you know. There is no more powerful test of the depth of your understanding than explaining it clearly to someone else. Teaching forces you to organize your knowledge, anticipate confusion, and discover the edges of what you actually understand versus what you merely think you understand. For social capital, the daily practices are these. Be genuinely curious about the people in your life. Ask real questions. Listen with real attention. Nothing builds social capital faster than the experience of being genuinely listened to. Nothing builds it more slowly than the experience of interacting with someone who is merely waiting for their turn to speak. Give without keeping score. Look for opportunities to offer value to the people in your network. A useful article, a relevant introduction, a piece of honest feedback, a word of genuine encouragement, without tracking what you are owed in return. The person who gives freely generates a kind of goodwill that eventually returns in ways that no scorekeeping system could predict. Show up for people in difficult moments. Congratulations are easy and common. Support during difficulty is rare and remembered. The colleague who checks in when you are struggling, the mentor who makes time when you are in crisis, the friend who shows up when the work is hard. These are the people who accumulate deep social capital because they have demonstrated that their care is unconditional. Maintain your relationships proactively, not reactively. Do not wait until you need something to reach out to the people in your network. Reach out when you have nothing to ask for, simply to connect, to share something of value, or to express genuine interest in how someone is doing. This kind of proactive maintenance is what keeps relationships warm and deepens them over time. Chapter 8. The Long Game. Building an invisible portfolio is, fundamentally, a long game. And the long game is deeply unfashionable in a culture that rewards the quick win, the viral moment, the fast return. But here is the truth about the long game. It is the only game that produces the outcomes most people actually want: deep expertise, trusted relationships, a reputation built on substance, financial returns that flow from genuine value rather than from the performance of value. An inner life rich enough to make success feel like something other than a hollow achievement. The long game requires patience. It requires the willingness to invest in things whose returns are invisible for years before they become apparent. It requires the emotional discipline to resist the pull of the aesthetic, to resist the temptation to perform success rather than build it. But the long game also comes with a profound advantage. Most people are not playing it. The field of genuine intellectual and social capital is remarkably uncrowded because most people are distracted by the visible, the immediate, and the superficial. Every day that you invest in your invisible portfolio, you are compounding an advantage that most of your competitors are not building. Every book read deeply, every relationship invested in genuinely, every idea reflected on honestly. These are deposits into a portfolio that will appreciate in ways that no visible asset can match. Conclusion. The invisible becomes the foundation. We began this journey by noting that we live in an age of the visible, of surface, performance, and aesthetic, and we have explored, across the chapters of this audiobook, the case for investing in what cannot be seen, the depth of your knowledge, the quality of your thinking, the richness of your relationships, the trustworthiness of your character. The invisible portfolio is the foundation on which everything else of lasting value is built. Not because appearances do not matter, but because without the substance underneath, appearance is our sand. The person who has built genuine intellectual capital brings something to every conversation, every collaboration, every challenge that no amount of polishing can replicate: actual wisdom, earned through genuine investment. The person who has built genuine social capital has something in every room they enter that no title or credential can manufacture: actual trust, earned through years of genuine care. Together, these invisible assets create a kind of wealth that is not subject to the volatility of markets, the caprice of fashion, or the depreciation of time. They are the assets that appreciate precisely because they are used. Because the more you apply genuine knowledge and genuine relationships to real problems in the world, the more of both you tend to accumulate. Begin building today, not with a grand gesture or a dramatic overhaul of your life. With the next book you pick up and actually read, with the next conversation you have where you are genuinely curious about the other person, with the next idea you sit with long enough to actually understand. The invisible portfolio is built one quiet, deliberate act at a time, and over the long arc of a life, it becomes the most extraordinary thing you have ever built. Thank you for listening. May your portfolio be rich with what cannot be seen, and may what cannot be seen be worth everything.